Well, it's a few minutes past 3 o'clock. I think we better start now. Welcome, everybody. My name is Martin Woos. I'm Deputy Director of the Migration Policy Center at the European University Institute in Florence. I'm delighted to see so many of you here for our fourth webinar in our lockdown webinar series. Today's focus is migration and mobility in the European Union. And many of the presentations will be based on a recent... It's past 3 o'clock, I think we better start now. Welcome everybody, my name is Martin Woos. I'm Deputy Director of the Migration Policy Center. Sorry, my YouTube. So this is based on a recent new book by Andrew Geddes, Leila, Hadj, Abdou, and Leiza Brumat, 3 researchers at the MPC. So this webinar also marks the publication of that book. And we also have Eiko Thielemann, who's Associate Professor in Political Science at the London School of Economics and also Director of the LSE's Migration Studies Unit. So Andrew, of course, as many of you will know, is Professor of Migration Studies and Director of the MPC, and Leila and Leiza are Research Fellows at the MPC. And the key question that we'll discuss today is how can past and current experiences of the governance of migration to, from, and within the European Union provide a guide to future dilemmas and challenges that arise from the current crisis with COVID-19. The way this works, as always, is we'll have presentations for about 30 minutes in total, and then I will take questions from you, the audience. And as is explained in the chat box on the YouTube channel, if you have any questions, please write them down in the chat box and let us know who the question is for. And I will then attempt to distribute the questions, group and distribute the questions to our speakers after the presentations are finished. So without any further ado, I'll hand it over to Andrew.
Thank you, Martin. Thanks a lot. As Martin said, what we're going to focus on today is migration and mobility in the EU, thinking about the past, the present, and the future. But obviously, one of the things to begin with is the world we live in now, which is a time of greatly constrained mobility, closed borders. I think 17 Schengen states have effectively closed their borders. Until very recently in Italy, where we're based, it was almost impossible to travel outside your own city, never mind consider international travel. What we also face is a close monitoring of our future mobility and also our social interactions, all in the name of controlling the virus. So temporarily, at least, we face a world with massively constrained and reduced migration mobility. So for us, that was a great time to publish the second edition of a book on migration and mobility in the EU. We couldn't have picked a better moment to decide that now was the time to publish a book on migration and mobility. But I think for people here today and participating in this seminar, I think all of us can see that what the pandemic has done is exposed issues that are central to our analysis of migration and mobility in the EU. These dilemmas and challenges don't go away because of the current situation. They may even be intensified. So what the book itself does is organises its analysis around phases of the policy process. So we look at debate, what we call talk. We look at decision making, and we look at implementation. So we make this distinction between talk, decision, and action. And we also then break down our analysis to look at different types of migration: labour migration, family migration, asylum refugee migration, irregular migration, debates about free movement, and also looking at citizenship and integration as a way to cut into the debates about migration and mobility, and to see the kind of different constellations of interests that can develop around different forms of migration and expose the policy and institutional dilemmas around those kinds of migration. And to point to some of the ambiguities in the policy process that can't easily be resolved. There's no kind of silver bullet that resolves these issues, not even a global pandemic. But what we can see now are some trade-offs, challenges, dilemmas that I think are maybe even more acute. And I've just identified 3 here, which I think are particularly relevant. The first of which is the tension between control and openness, which obviously we all know is basically at the heart of any discussion of immigration. How do you how if you accept a world of states, a world of borders, and a world of controls, some don't, but if you do accept that, and we as the kind of world in which we live, there is I think a renewed debate about the relationship between control and openness. We see it to some extent in regularizations that have occurred in some countries, but also a renewed debate about the essential role played by migrant workers in European economies. And we hosted our first MPC lockdown webinar on that very topic. And I think that dilemma is made more acute by the current crisis. Second, I think we see those forms of migration which are less visible becoming more visible, and exposing, well, I don't think you would call it a dilemma, but some of the, in a sense, some of the kind of almost like horrors of what you could call migration governance. Conditions in camps, people pushed towards irregular routes, and further pressure to do what the EU refers to as externalization, but is, you know, an important aspect of EU migration governance, but that is cooperation or imposition of EU measures on non-EU member states. And thirdly, I think we see some change in the terms of political debate, or scope for change in political debate. Immigration is now a lower salience issue. There's also a greater awareness of the contribution made by migrants, but I don't think that means that underlying attitudes will be transformed. But also, I think it helps us understand that the debate about immigration is not a simple binary, pro or anti. I think people are clearly capable of understanding some of the nuances, and perhaps some more policy, some space is being created for a renewed debate about migration. And so finally, what does all this mean? Well, I think that one thing to think about is the Commission's new global compact on migration and asylum, announced in December 2019 by the incoming Commission President, and raising some crucial issues which will define European Union migration and mobility governance in years to come. Just to pick out three as a final point, which I think are crucial to what we're going to talk about today: responsibility sharing or solidarity and the future for that. How you can strengthen and protect people seeking asylum or with refugee status, how that relates to border controls and pressures towards irregularization. And also legal pathways, what are called legal pathways, and some opening recently in discussion about sponsorship models, perhaps looking towards Canada, all of which are live issues, were live issues, are and will remain. And so I'll leave it there and hand over to, I think Leila's going to go next, so thank you.
Sorry, yes, now I'm unmuted. So thanks very much also for joining. I'm very delighted that I can also share some insights and thoughts about the book. So just let me share my screen with you so you can see my slides I prepared. Yes. Okay. So I want to focus a little bit about irregular migration, since this is one of the chapters we extensively cover in the book, and is also one of the most developed areas of EU migration policy and policy making. And of course, this is an issue which has even much more relevance now with COVID-19. Why? First, as Andrew already mentioned, because of the closure of border, which really affects significantly the routes. Then also, of course, very practical health issues concerning detention of migrants, deportation, and also the homelessness of irregularized migrants. So I think the really interesting question to pose is which approaches the EU is going to take, facing also these new challenges because of the crisis. Will we see more restrictive approaches or more pragmatic approaches? When we look at other world regions, for instance, the United States, you see that the crisis has actually enabled more restrictive approaches. I mean, recently, when you followed the media, also the deportation of migrants to countries such as Guatemala or Haiti really challenged the health systems in these countries there, and you have more restrictive approaches. Whereas in Europe, as I want to outline here today, you see a more balanced and more ambivalent approaches, and you see potentials going in both directions, a more pragmatic approach or also like a more restrictive approach. Andrew briefly mentioned public opinion, and of course, which approach the European Union and its member states are taking or will be taking in the near future also has a lot to do with how the public sees migration or how policymakers perceive public opinion. And we tried to debunk many myths in the book about public opinion, that actually the public is much less hostile than we often assume, and that it's much more not black and white, so to say. But also what we know, that that citizens are much more concerned about irregular migration. So this is the form of migration they are most concerned with. But again, here, when we look at the health crisis, what does it mean and what does it imply in public opinion? First of all, so-called low-skilled migrants, which often for whom no regular pathways exist, actually those ones are now much more seen in a more favorable light because they're often seen as essential workers. So this is one potential effect also of the crisis. But also, on the other hand, we see also that it has a potential for more restrictive approaches, because like often migrants are seen now as being the carriers of risks or health risks or stigmatized in this way. So here you have really both potentials. But also, as Andrew already said, migration is much more salient now because people simply care about health issues and much less about issues of migration. And also what we can see actually, and this is really very interesting, that we see a downturn of the radical right, which can also affect, of course, approaches to different forms of migration, including irregular one. But also we have to stay realistic. So there is a decline in the support for the radical right in public opinion, but also they are still strong. And of course, concerns about globalization can become now even much more vocal. So again, here we see both potentials. But then when we look in terms of policies, and we also extensively covered this in the book, that actually previously in the European Union and its member states, you have a mix of approaches, how they responded to irregular migration. But then latest with 2015 and the migration crisis, you can see a tipping point, and really return or deportation of migrants has been the preferred solution. And others, just such as regularizations, were really not on the table anymore. So very few people, including me, would have thought that we will see in the near future regularization programs. But actually, just in the country where we live, in Italy, you have seen in these very days a migration, like a regularization policy. So also because of the crisis and health crisis and of the shortage of workers in sectors such as agriculture, but the regularization also applies to others like fishing and care sectors. So this is really a factor that is taken into account, and we can see, or maybe we can see like approaches of a comeback of more economic interests versus a very politicized and contested climate. So at least we have both approaches again on the table, and we see what we before we didn't see, namely that economic groups, lobbyist groups, but also Catholic interest groups have now much more say in policy making again. Let me just briefly turn to debates, and what we observe in the book is a very strong focus on the facilitation of migration in debate about irregular migration, namely smuggling and particularly irregular arrivals. What does this mean? It really shifted away the focus that most of migrants who are regular don't arrive regularly, but basically they overstay their visas. And it also was a very nice solution, so to say, for policymakers focusing on smugglers. They could put the weight of attention to other effective solutions, such as regular pathways, which were often unwanted by member states, or also not feasible for the European Union, because they simply do not have any power for creating legal pathways. So what we see now with the health crisis, and which is also reported by latest UNODC report from this May, that with COVID-19, like the routes become much more risky, and also it will, what means also that migrants are much more reliant on smugglers than they have been even before. So I think, and what we can see and what we can predict, that in the public debate, given also still that regular pathways are still far from a consensus in European member states, or there is still a lack of this policy approach, that we see a continuous focus on smuggling and irregular arrivals. So let me come to the last point, namely the implementation. What we observed in the book is a very tough talk, but in the end, restrained implementation, what we call a so-called deportation gap. So for instance, in 2018, you had 287,000 deportation orders, but only 148,000 enforced. Why? Because deportations are very, very costly, but of course there is also administrative barriers, such lack of papers of migrants. And of course, there is also resistance often in the population against deportation. But also we will see, or we already see, of course, this increase of the deportation gap simply because of health issues. States cannot deport, but also you see like a rethinking of deterrence policies because again of health concerns that more and more states also decide to release vulnerable persons, and also the guidelines by the European Commission says that removal and detention shall cease when it appears that reasonable removal does not longer exist. And so quite some states have like released people from detentions for health issues. And also what you, of course, you see with the COVID crisis is much more a focus on vulnerability of those so-called unremovables, those who can't be removed for several reasons, but they have very little access in terms of services, health services and others. But this poses, of course, a health challenge. And here again, we might see much more pragmatic approaches. And also, for instance, one very pragmatic approach is also the extensions of visas, which are about to expire, for instance, in the UK, for health workers, frontline health workers. So here you see lots of pragmatic approaches. So again, what I want to strengthen, that we really see potential for both more pragmatic approaches, but also a potential for maybe risks. But so thanks so much so far. I'll stop here. Thanks for listening, but of course much more in the book, and also my colleague Leiza will now also still give some insights on another form of migration.
Thank you very much, Leila. Before we move on to Leiza, the third co-author, may I just remind everybody that there is an opportunity to ask questions. If you have a question, please write it in the chat box on the YouTube channel. And please also indicate who the question is for, and we'll try to respond to the questions after presentations. Okay, with that, we'll move on to the third speaker, Leiza Brumat, who is also a co-author of the book.
So, let me share the screen with you. I'm not able to share the screen right now. Okay, now I can. So, can you see it well? Great. So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. My presentation will focus on mobility. So I would like to start by saying that the book makes, in the context of the EU, a basic distinction between migration, which refers to third country nationals, and mobility, which refers to EU citizens exercising their right to free movement. Now, in the first edition of the book made a distinction between two basic paradigms that inform debates on mobility. There is, on the one hand, a liberal and free trade oriented paradigm, which focuses on the economic benefits of mobility. And then there's a state-centric, more restrictive paradigm that focuses on the conditionality aspects of mobility. Now, the first edition of the book is from 2010, and a lot of things have happened in the last 10 years. So for instance, we had the 2008 economic crisis, we had the migration crisis, which is also addressed and studied in the book. But the point is that all these events had an effect on mobility. And the main effect that we analyze and we study is the politicization of mobility. Now, the paradigmatic case of politicization of mobility is the UK and Brexit. Well, in the Leave campaign, we analyze and we study how the Leave campaign framed EU mobility as EU migration and mixed it with the refugee crisis. We have also identified how in the period that we studied, the second paradigm, that is the more state-centric, the more restrictive paradigm, tended to gain more place and more salience within the European institutions and within the debates on mobility. So for instance, the European Court of Justice issued a number of rulings that suggested a more restrictive interpretation of residence and access to social rights. Now, we know that free movement and EU citizenship have a very deep and intimate relationship, and that EU citizenship rights are directly related to the exercise of mobility, and that the EU has created quite a unique regime in the world, even if other regions of the world have also created their own facilitated mobility regimes. But this one, with all these characteristics and all the, even the bureaucracy that is related to it, is quite unique. But what is more particular of it is that free movement is inherently seen as a good or positive thing. And as we mentioned in the book, the Eurobarometer has consistently shown that European citizens value free movement as one of the highest achievements of European integration. So mobility, as we know, lies at the heart of the European project and is in general seen as a positive thing, with national differences and with many complexities. But in general, that is the idea. Now, what happens with mobility with the latest crisis? Mobility has also been at the heart of the policy responses to the COVID crisis. We have seen unprecedented restrictions to mobility, and we have also heard many speeches by political leaders that linked policy responses to a bellicose vocabulary. So we have heard, for instance, political leaders saying that we are at war, or we need war-like, even academics, saying that we need war-like responses to deal with the pandemic. These policy responses are directly related to restrictions to mobility. So we have seen unprecedented restrictions to mobility within the Schengen area and also to travel outside of the Schengen area. So non-essential travel was forbidden, which gave a lot of power of discretion to the officials and authorities at the borders to decide who could enter or leave the Schengen area based on what they understood as essential, non-essential travel. These had consequences on the understandings of mobility, because mobility, as the European Commission President said recently, she said, talking about the European travel ban, the less we travel, the more we contain the virus. So mobility right now is being part of a narrative related to a threat and a danger. And now we know, after a lot of studies by the scientists, that what increases the risk of contagion is physical proximity. And so physical distancing is what is advised. Now, physical distancing and mobility are related. And maybe at the beginning of the crisis, some restrictions to mobility were necessary because of the link that there is between physical distance and mobility. However, we have to remember that physical distance and mobility are still two different things. And if we, and this is my take on this, and if we, in the long term, keep on relating mobility to a danger and to a threat, we could risk legitimizing more restrictive responses and more restrictions to mobility. So what is the way forward? Well, I would propose that to understand the possible scenarios from now onwards, we could use what we have studied in this edition of the book and follow the theoretical and conceptual approach of the book and see what happens in four main dimensions. One are the narratives and ideas. And as I just mentioned, we could see that recently the ideas around mobility related to a threat and to a danger, but we can see that the changes in the idea of mobility are part of a longer term trend that we study in the book. We should also take a look at the public administration and bureaucratic aspects. So for instance, we could ask ourselves, will the country succumb to the temptation of reforming some of the regulatory rules for mobility, establishing new exceptions for mobility or new types of emergencies? We should also take a look at the implementation of these policies. We have seen that in the light of the recent crisis, the discretion to police and border authorities to choose whoever can enter or leave a country is based on their understanding of what an essential travel is and on the body temperature of people. How will coordination of the implementation of these new rules, how will be these coordinated between countries? And finally, we shouldn't forget the politics of this, which will be the role of the far rights and the Eurosceptic parties that usually tend to frame migration as mobility as a dangerous and as a threat. But we should look at this politics, as we say in the book, in different levels, because we have seen recently that the management or the mismanagement of the health crisis at the local level had very important consequences at the national and then very important repercussions at the regional level. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Leiza. So we've had the three co-authors of the book develop some of the key themes of the book and apply them to the current discussion around COVID-19, with Andrew setting the scene with some of the key dilemmas, Leila talking about some of the challenges with irregular migration, and then Leiza highlighting issues to do with free movement itself. And we'll now turn to Eiko Thielemann, who's done a lot of work on both free movement within the EU, but also on migration to the EU itself. Eiko.
All right, thank you, Martin. Hello from London, or as we call it now, Brexit Island. I wanted to thank you all for inviting me to participate in this panel, and congratulations to you for the second edition. I've been using the first edition since it came out in 2011, and it's been on my reading list for my MSc students, my graduate students at the LSE on their program International Migration and Public Policy since it came out in 2011. What I always thought when I first read the book was that it was extremely insightful, comprehensive, a nice introduction for those who are not that familiar with migration topics, but also providing quite a lot of insights for those who work on these issues on a regular basis. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity to discuss some of the, I guess, new additions that you brought in this second version of the book. What I want to do in the next 10 minutes or so is highlight what I regard as some of the key contributions that the book makes. I will also illustrate some of these from my own area of expertise, which is mainly refugee policy. And I will also use the opportunity to maybe reflect on how some of the insights of the book relate to the current challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. So let me start by just summarizing what I see as the three main contributions, or at least the ones that I want to focus on over the next few minutes, right? So first of all, I feel that the book fills a clear gap in the literature with regard to the role of the EU or regional governance more generally in the migration literature. Secondly, it advances our understanding conceptually of the notion of policy failure that I would like to talk a little bit about. And thirdly, it reminds us of the need for cooperation and solidarity between countries when they're trying to develop more effective migration governance. And I think that's perhaps particularly clear in times like the current one, when we're faced with a crisis. So let me start with the idea that the book is clearly filling a gap in the literature. I think it's my firm belief, and maybe I would say that, that you cannot understand contemporary migration governance in Europe without reference to the EU, right? And I think I'm somewhat surprised that there are still too many texts about migration and mobility that that treat regional actors like the EU almost like an afterthought, right? If I look at the migration literature more broadly. And I think the reason why this is particularly surprising for me is because we all know about the limitations of national policies in regulating what by its very essence are transnational flows. And we also know about the enormous impediments that policymakers face when trying to develop policies at the global level. Right. So I guess from that perspective, there is an obvious role for regional governance institutions, right, when it comes to developing effective policy responses. And clearly, the EU is perhaps the most advanced experiment of regional cooperation in this area, as the book clearly highlights. My second point is about this concept of policy failure that you draw on quite extensively in the book. I think there is, of course, a long-standing literature on policy failure in the migration literature, right? Stephen Castles, for one, right, has written extensively on this. And what I like about the way that you engage with this concept is that you provide for quite an effective challenge to some of the underlying assumptions that much of the literature on policy failure seems to be based on. And in particular, you remind us of the fact that, of course, not just in migration policy, but maybe particularly in migration policy, right? Policymakers often pursue multiple objectives, some of which might be stated, others might not be stated and be non-stated objectives, right? Sometimes these objectives might be complementary to each other, sometimes they might be in tension or might even directly contradict each other. So assessing, right, what constitutes a policy failure in the realm of migration is perhaps less obvious as it first appears. And I think you make that case very strongly and very persuasively in the book. When we apply this concept to the EU context, right, I think we can ask two questions. And I think you partly do that as well in the book. One is, I guess, the question about to what extent has the EU made a difference? And is migration governance now that the EU has competences in this area fundamentally different to how it was 25, 30 years ago when the EU was not involved? And here I think what your book offers is, I guess, a slightly more nuanced and I guess realistic account than what we sometimes read in the existing literature on the role of the European Union, right? So while you acknowledge that some of the kind of policy cores of European policies have not fundamentally changed as a result of the involvement of the EU, right? We still have obviously this tension that Andrew was talking about between openness and restrictiveness, right? We still have obviously these difficulties with regard to safe access that Andrew mentioned as well. And hence, I guess some of the conclusions that authors like Sandra Lovener have drawn about kind of, especially maybe forced migration policy being an instance of what she called organized hypocrisy, probably still applies nowadays as it did 30 years ago, right? But on the other hand, you do also stress and acknowledge I guess, some of the, achievements of the EU and the changes that it has introduced in terms of developing additional safeguards and sometimes new rights for particularly vulnerable groups when it comes to migration. And so I think your assessment, I think, as I said, is a little bit more balanced than what we sometimes see in the wider literature. But we can apply this notion of policy failure, I guess, in the EU context to another question that I'm particularly interested in, and that is the question about how do we assess the 2015 refugee crisis in terms of this policy failure debate. A lot of people, of course, have been very critical about the role of the EU during the Syrian refugee crisis. But I don't necessarily disagree with those assessments. On the other hand, I suggest that it might be insightful to also look at the counterfactual and ask the question, what would Europe's response to the Syrian crisis in 2015 would have looked like without any EU involvement, if there hadn't been an EU dimension to Europe's policy response. And what I would suggest is that ultimately, I guess, our assessment about the EU's track record when it comes to migration governance depends on our expectations, right? What we expected the EU to do. And in that sense, I think the debate on this reminds me a little bit about the debate that international relations scholars have had with regard to EU foreign policy. My colleague, Chris Hill at LSE, or former colleague, talked about the capability expectation gap in foreign policy. And I think we see probably something similar in certain quarters of the migration literature, that maybe the expectations of what the EU has been expected to achieve in this area were perhaps higher than its capabilities would have always led us to realistically expect. All right, so that's on my second point, and I'm moving on to the third key contribution that I see, and that's the idea that your book reminds us of the need for cooperation and solidarity when trying to develop effective policies for migration governance. I think this is particularly clear in the area of refugee protection, as your book highlights. I think you rightly argue that from the outset of EU policy making, EU policies have been driven, at least in part, by the perceived need for solidarity and responsibility sharing. Right? You mentioned the example of the early 1990s during the Yugoslav crisis, right? When the distributions of responsibilities were highly unequal, Germany being responsible for 2/3 of all asylum applications. And again, we've seen similar patterns more recently, right? During the Syrian crisis, when Germany again took 50% of all asylum requests, but also smaller countries, Greece, Italy, Sweden, and so on, were particularly affected. You also highlight, of course, the role of EU policies in being partly responsible for the unequal distribution of responsibilities. And here, of course, the Dublin regulation, right, stands out for sure. So I agree that solidarity remains one of the key challenges for the EU. And I would even go so far as to say that the issue of solidarity is, I guess, a necessary element of trying to achieve solutions to other core challenges that you address in the book, right? The challenges of insufficient harmonization, of implementation gaps that were mentioned earlier, of the perceived need for externalization when it comes to EU policies, right? And I would even go as far as to say that we cannot effectively address these challenges without having made some progress on the issue of solidarity and redistributive politics. And of course, effective EU solidarity in the area of migration should not just be about solidarity between the member states, right? It should also be about solidarity with third countries, right? And that's where obviously the externalization dimension comes in. But most importantly, it should also be about solidarity with migrants themselves. And the COVID crisis reminds us how crucial these notions of solidarity are, in particular, during a crisis. So we have already solidarity discussions with regard to debt and economic recovery, right, which are in full swing in the EU. My argument would be we need to properly restart those discussions in relation to migration governance issues as well. But COVID-19, of course, and the current pandemic, of course, does not just raise issues around solidarity, but it raises a number of wider migration-related questions. And maybe we can pick up some of these in the question and answers, right? So, for example, what will be the longer-term impact in relation to unwanted migration pressures, right? At the moment, of course, the pressure of asylum requests seems to have gone down as a result of the crisis. What are our expectations in terms of longer-term developments in that regard? Or questions like, what will be the impact of the crisis on the propensity to migrate? Right? We talked about, obviously, border closures and questions of openness and closeness, but how will individuals feel about their preference to migrate or not? And of course, I'm thinking here from where I'm sitting at the in London and at the LSE, in particular about international students, right, and their propensity to still migrate to other countries and institutions. And ultimately, I guess we need to think more about what impact on policies, right, we expect, and what role we would ascribe the EU to play in this regard, right? We've had very diverse responses so far, right? From, I guess, very migrant-centered responses in Portugal to, I guess, quite the opposite in places like Hungary, right? And I guess the question is, to what extent will the EU be able to speak with one voice on some of these core issues? Of course, the book was long finished before COVID-19 struck, but I would argue it does offer readers some great guidance on how to think systematically about these questions and others. And so I'll leave it with that, and well done again for the second edition. Congratulations.
Thank you very much, Eiko, for a brilliant discussion of some of the key themes, but also asking more questions. So what I'll attempt to do is organize 2 or 3 rounds of question and answers. Quite a few of you have posted questions, and I will try to kind of assign them to our different speakers, maybe 2 or 3 questions per speaker. And if I could just ask for short answers so we can do more rounds. First couple of questions for Leila. Anna Kompacha asks about unremovable persons and the extent to which you think that that issue will be addressed in the new Pact on Migration and Asylum. And Laura Clayton asks a related question about the selective release of vulnerable persons from detention versus those with criminal records. So whether or not there are increasing divides in this, on this issue. Maybe a couple of questions for Andrew. One comes from Mary Walters on the impact of COVID on cooperation with other EU countries, especially Greece, in terms of relocation of asylum seekers. We know that some countries have already relocated minors and children from Greece, but what's the impact of COVID? And maybe also for Andrew, what's the more general impact on migrant rights, on the debate about migrant rights? Maybe a question for Aiko from Sarah Poli on the use of informal agreements in the field of migration and its impact on the powers of European Parliament. And there's also a more general question from Sonia Xir. What do you think the main arguments are for promoting international migration in a post-COVID area? And finally, a couple of questions for Leiza. There's one question about to what extent you think that the reinstatement of border controls changes really the narrative around free movement or changes the whole concept of free movement, and might actually mean that when we return to free movement, the movement of some people will be much freer than for others. So I'll leave it at that for now. If you could just respond maybe in the order which you spoke over. So we'll start with Andrew maybe.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks for the questions. Thanks also to Aiko for his great comments. It's much appreciated. I think Mary had a question about the situation in Greece with the relocation of unaccompanied children. I think agreement was recently reached to relocate around 1,600 children, unaccompanied minors from Greece, but it was a long and tortuous process, which is essentially impelled by the crisis itself. So I think it was a good outcome that took a long time to get to. So I think that, you know, it's a kind of interesting case to look at. But I think more broadly in relation to migrants' rights, if you look at underlying tendencies, you would see irregularization of migration because of border controls, and also the criminalization of migration. So one of the issues around migrants' rights is whether current developments offer scope to challenge the irregularization of migration through various kind of pathways that could be created that are more regular. And also underlying tendency to criminalize migration, which we see very strongly in Italy, but also in other countries as well, such as other member states of the European Union. I think those are the key challenges to migrants' rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Leila.
Yes, thanks so much for all the great questions. Really very much appreciated and give lots of food for thought. Just very briefly, maybe you mentioned, so first, somebody asked about the unremovables and if there will be more focus on them. As I said, I suspect that this should be the case. I mean, this would be high time also. But also, I think it depends which actors are also more powerful and which will get the voice. For instance, we see that very much local authorities, for instance, here they are much more pragmatic because they have to deal with the consequences, like with homelessness and these health issues, as I mentioned. So I think it also depends which actors can have a say here. The other thing, there was also very good question about the selection, whether this will highlight much more or divide between different migrants or the criminal migrants in terms and others. So I think this, I can't tell right now, but I think this is an interesting dynamic when we look at other regions of the world, like the US, where this is a very strong component. So this can be a likely scenario, but I think in terms about the health risks in certain facilities, which will be also much more on the radar. I think Paddy had also very excellent questions about what about the human rights about those migrants who want to return but are kept in a country. Whereas, for instance, EU citizens, you see that they could at least return to their residence. I think this is very important. And I recently read also a newspaper article that actually people are now using smugglers to return to their countries of residence. So I think this is really also a dynamic which needs to be taken into account. And also I think Regina Paul asked a very interesting question about will there be more focus on undesired and desired migrants, whereas the desired will be those low-skilled, whereas the undesired might be more EU migrants. I think the issue is that often these categories overlap. So, and also there is no clear answer, both potentials, and I think it's very interesting now that the UK just released also for the migration pathways about care workers who are seen among the most essential workers and often like they are EU citizens, that those are not included into the those who can migrate in the income scheme. So I think it really depends and can go both ways. Yeah, but thanks so much to everyone for the questions. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Leila. Leiza?
Yeah. Well, on whether free movement will there will be changes to free movement as a consequence of the reinstatement of border controls. And maybe freer for some people than for others. Yes, we address the differences both at the national level in the exercise of free movement and by group of migrants as well. We address this in the book, and a good example for this is Erasmus. So for instance, the Erasmus program is not accessed by everyone for equal. There's some countries that have much more access, whose students use the Erasmus program much more than others. What we may see is that as the economic crisis related to the current COVID crisis increases inequalities, like most of economic crises tend to do, maybe we will see more unequal opportunities for moving. So yeah, the inequalities of mobility may be enhanced as a consequence of the economic crisis. Then, but I also think that maybe major changes to free movement are not very likely, mainly because it brings mobility, it brings many economic benefits, which are very necessary right now in face of the current economic and coming economic recession. So what we may see that are maybe facilitated exceptions for mobility. So I think that we should take a closer look at the bureaucratic and regulatory aspects of mobility, because maybe some small regulatory aspects may change.
Thank you, Leiza. Aiko?
Right, thank you. So I picked up two questions. One from Sarah about the role of informal agreements, in particular with regard to the role of the European Parliament. I think it's an interesting point, right? Of course, we are all in favor of kind of transparency of policy making. But what we see in the EU context, of course, is that you don't really need to go to informal agreements, and you see how the European Parliament is sidelined to a certain extent still. I think, for example, of the 2015 relocation decision, right? One of the key policy developments in recent years. And this was undertaken under the so-called consultation procedure. So the Parliament was basically sidelined and pushed into a consultation-only role, rather than having its kind of usual role as a co-legislator in the EU policy-making system. But of course, when people think about informal agreements, they mostly think about kind of agreements such as the ones that the EU has struck with Turkey or with Libya, and I guess here clearly the Parliament is very much sidelined, right? The accountability function of Parliament doesn't work. Of course, in the context of the EU-Turkey agreement, obviously one might ask whether that's an EU agreement at all, right? And the ECJ, when it recently was asked the question, it basically denied that and said, well, it's really an agreement between sovereign states under international law, rather than something that the European Court of Justice has jurisdiction over. The second question that I just wanted to briefly address is the question by Sonia about what the arguments might be in the current period for promoting migration and cooperation on migration. Right? Of course, while obviously I would not advocate a kind of immediate return to kind of the status quo ante, clearly, obviously, the reasons why people migrate will not go away post COVID-19, right? We will still have lots of good reasons why people want to move across international borders, whether that's for family, for humanitarian, or for work reasons. And I think what we need to, I guess, be careful of is to kind of establish policy responses that might, I guess, be in denial of those real reasons for wanting to migrate. And And of course, some of the arguments for international cooperation, of course, certainly have not gone away either, right? Arguments about responsibility sharing, about a level playing field in terms of standards and so on. These exist currently as they did before.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have time for one more round of brief answers to some of these questions. Apologies to the audience if I can't get through all the questions. We're getting quite a few questions now. So I'll start another round. We have one question for Andrew from Paddy Knudsen about Germany's approach announced during COVID for a cash for visas for Africans to curb irregular migration. So I suppose there's the general question about cooperation with transit countries or with African countries and financial assistance in return for help with addressing irregular migration. And then there's also specific questions about, I think this is what this refers to, if I understood correctly, new legal pathways that might be associated with a deposit that migrants actually make. I think this was a recent German proposal. There's a question for Aiko and maybe also for Leiza from Rock Espresso. And the question here is, to what extent, how would you compare the responses of the European Union to those of other regional blocs, comparatively speaking? So Leiza might also be able to say something about this. A question for Leila. Have you dealt in the book with different approaches to migration in different EU member states in terms of public attitudes and with regard to openness to immigration, and what are the implications of that? There's maybe one more question also for Aiko from Luisa Marin in terms of coming back to your theme of policy failures. I mean, given that, for example, in particular relocation, the whole debate about relocation to some extent has been a failure, what does that mean for debates going forward? What does that idea of policy failure tell us about what's going to happen in the future? And finally, a question for Andrew, and again, maybe that can also be addressed by Leila, is to what extent COVID-19 has led to a return of national protectionism, and to what extent is that an obstacle to future immigration policy making? Okay, we'll do this round and we'll start again with Andrew.
Thanks, Martin. I didn't actually get the second question. Could you just say it again? I missed. I got a bit of a problem with my connection just as you spoke.
The idea that COVID-19 is leading to more national protectionism.
Oh yeah.
What are the implications of that going forward for the immigration debate?
Yeah. So yeah, two questions. The first of which was from Paddy, and I think he talked about this cash for visas as whether it was a pathway or bad taste. And I think actually, potentially both of those things. I mean, is it a pathway? Well, yes, it's a pathway, and it's not necessarily unusual for visas to be offered in exchange for cash payments, in some kind of commitment. Whether it's fair and just is a very different question. So I think it's an interesting debate that some of our colleagues in the Global Citizenship Programme at EUI have looked at very closely. I'd recommend that Paddy perhaps has a look at that work as well. But is it a pathway? Well, yeah, it's a pathway, but it can't be. If this is the only mechanism for entry to Europe, then it's a highly unequal and unfair way to manage access to the European Union. In terms of the kind of point about renationalisation, I think that's a really important point, because if we look at the dynamics of the EU, you could contrast a vertical dynamic, a relationship between member states and the European Union, a more horizontal dynamic where states maybe group together with countries that they are like-minded with. And I think that's a key dilemma in the European Union at the moment, is this emergence of groups of states within the European Union, this horizontal dynamic which challenges the idea of a vertical relationship between member states in the EU. So I think that it's not necessarily renationalisation, but it changes the context for European integration and changes the way that member states interact with each other to some extent, and possibly weakens the vertical dynamic. So thanks for the questions.
Leila?
Yes, yeah, so very good questions again. Maybe I also want to say something about national protectionism, because this is very dear to my heart. It's because it's a very fascinating topic. So, but I think we also have to see that it's not about only about national protectionism, because when you follow closely the whole debate about COVID, it's fascinating that both is presented. So it's really the polarization of society and the issues. So there is the ones who say, no, we need closed borders, globalization is bad. And then there is the other ones who say, okay, we need more international cooperation in order to solve these challenges. So these very same struggles and like fights, which is inherent to the migration policy debate, is also inherent, and you see now in the response and the debate about COVID. So I think it's not only one-sided, it's really the more polarized and people who are not speaking or with each other, but have very divisive opinions about the issue. And this relates also to the very good question about public attitudes and openness, like in different regions of Europe. So we tackle this in the book, also looking at public attitudes. And I think it's, again, very interesting topic where we can really see that it's not about numbers of migrants, how the public feels, but also lots has to do with the salience and how politicians also speak about the issue, how salient they make the issue. And I think here I want to refer also to one of our colleagues at the MPC who did lots of work about education, also in Central and Eastern Europe, and who also, Lenka Prajanova, who explains also this issue about that it's really about which type of institutions educate also citizens. And from this, we can also explain how people think and feel about migration. So, and another issue I want to just very briefly say something on is about externalization. Will we see more or less? I think we will definitely see even more attempts of externalization. So like that the EU and its member states trying to attempt people coming from Europe through a cooperation with countries of origin and transit. But also I think it's really interesting that it's not that straightforward. And for instance, like also the African Union has resisted also quite some of these attempts because it goes against goals in the region also for freedom of movement. So I think this is very interesting, an interesting aspect of this. Yeah.
Thank you. Leiza?
Yes. Well, similarities and differences with other regions. I will refer to South America because it's the one that I know best. Thank you, Rox Pereso, I like your nickname, for the question. We can see that there's coordination and lack of coordination at the same time in other world regions. So for instance, in South America, they are coordinated, like the closing of borders between the countries has been coordinated, but at the same time, there is a lack of coordination in the general responses, which leads to other types of mobility, for instance, in return mobility. There are very different national approaches, as we can also see, well, to the quarantines and to the lockdowns, which we also saw that happen in the European Union, but that's maybe more pronounced in the case of South America. There are also coordinated joint purchases of medical supplies. For instance, there's coordination for that. Well, the mobility at the borders is quite limited, as is happening here, and is very controlled, but over there it is militarized in some borders. But something that is quite notorious in the case of South America and some Latin American countries is that they are still accepting the mobility of refugees and asylum in general terms. A good example for this is Uruguay, accepting everyone arriving there claiming for asylum.
Thank you, Leiza. Aiko?
Yeah, thanks. Just briefly to follow up on what Leiza said about regional cooperation. I guess the difference for me, certainly in the context of refugee protection, is that, of course, there is a much more binding, legally developed framework in the EU than we see in other kind of regional governance frameworks. And I think it will be really interesting to assess, right, in due course, right, whether that kind of legally binding framework actually makes a difference in times of crisis when there is a lot of temptation, right, to, I guess, bend the rules. And of course, we saw it with Greece suspending asylum applications, right, earlier this year. And so I think the temptations are there. And the question is, how effective are legally binding rules in those contexts? The other question from Leiza was about relocation and kind of the experiences with the 2015 relocation decision. 160,000 people were supposed to be relocated. Only about 30,000 were in the end. I guess a lot of people would regard that as obviously falling severely short over the stated objective. On the other hand, of course, if you compare it with other attempts to relocate individuals across the member states, right? We had, for example, voluntary schemes to relocate individuals from Malta and other places. And we were talking kind of a couple of dozens of people at that time. And for me, the broad question still remains, right? I just don't see what the alternatives of thinking about future relocation, mandatory relocation measures would be. Any attempt to go back to the times of voluntary relocation that we've tried many times before and which clearly have not produced any results do not fulfill me with a lot of confidence. But certainly not a fully blown success story for the EU either, as you rightly say.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got five more minutes, so I don't think we have time for a full round of 2 questions for each, but maybe what I'll do is pick up on 2 issues that I think a number of people in our audience have raised, and it's also come through the presentations that we've heard. One relates to this question of whether COVID-19 is going to lead to a big change in attitudes. And there are questions about seasonal workers, workers in essential services, and to what extent is the debate going forward, not really about solidarity, about burden responsibility sharing, but more of necessity. And to what extent are we going to see a change in attitudes and policy? And is, more importantly, perhaps even, is that change going likely to be longer term, or rather than just a temporary change to deal with the crisis? So I'll just have these 2 issues and we'll go through the list of speakers. You don't all have to answer, but if you would like to briefly respond, then please do so. We'll start with Andrew again.
Thanks, Martin. On attitudes, and do we expect to see a kind of change in attitudes? Well, I don't think we like to see change in underlying attitudes, in the factors that structure and drive attitudes to migration. I think they're well established and fairly stable. I think we'll see changes in issue salience. We've seen a very strong decline in the salience of migration. But I think what we also see in terms of debate is, the demonstration, the debate is not a simple binary. It's not simply pro or anti. There is much room in between for a discussion about migration, but then I think it becomes even more relevant to think about how you communicate about migration in ways that relate to attitudes as they are in their complexity. And just to give a plug on that, in 2 weeks' time, our next MPC webinar will be on attitude. So if you want to learn more, come to our next MPC webinar. So thanks.
Thank you. Leila, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, I think I don't add anything on attitudes particularly because I think I share what Andrew said, but I think also what is interesting in terms to think not only about attitudes, but also about how migration is governed and organized, that actually I think the current health crisis shows very much that it's about deeper systemic and institutional responses. Like, for instance, when you think about essential workers, how food production, how all these things are organized, no? And I think this is one of the big opportunities that we can think ahead and not only think about migration as an issue, but the surrounding institutional setups and systems. So I think, again, like every crisis can be a chance if we can also think in broader terms and not in a very narrow terms about migration.
Thank you, Leila. Leiza, do you want to add anything?
I just wanted to add on what Andrew and Leila said about the salience of migration. Well, I think that we should pay attention from now on to the salience of mobility in certain national contexts, particularly with the coming economic crisis now that is a consequence of this current crisis. And particularly, we should pay some attention to access to welfare from other EU citizens, because we have seen right now. Cases, for instance, of Polish citizens Polish workers in the Netherlands not having access to the same welfare benefits in the light of the current crisis. So I think that is a topic that we should pay attention to.
Thank you, Leiza, and we'll leave the last word to you, Aiko.
Thank you. Just very briefly, I think it's a great question, and I think while we might not expect obviously changes in attitudes in the short term, I think what we do already see, I feel, certainly here in the UK, is a slightly better discussion about what we mean by certain categories of migrants, like the low-skilled migrants, right? Basically, I think it is becoming clearer that what we mean is people who we don't pay very well, right? It's the low-paid migrants, right? And I think more people realize that the way that we define low-paid basically makes it very difficult for nurses, carers, and other key workers to actually get legal access to the UK these days. So hopefully slightly better debate on these issues can be the result of this.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Well, thank you to all the speakers. I'd like to draw this to a close. Thank you to everybody who's tuned in. Thanks for your great questions. If you have joined us for the first time, please do check out our work at the Immigration Policy Center and also Aiko's work at the LSC. And as Andrew mentioned, we will have our next webinar on attitudes to migration in 2 weeks. So please keep an eye out for that. So thanks again for joining us. All the best, stay safe, and goodbye.
Thank you, bye.
Bye.